In these videos, we want to go beyond just looking at maybe a particular tool or methodology that Paul used. We want to see how it all fits together. And in order to do that, we really need to have an understanding of how Paul viewed himself. And we see as we read, both in Luke, but especially in his letters, how Paul introduces himself over and over as an apostle, as a sent one. And this term, as he uses it, and how we see it in the New Testament, I believe is quite different from its contemporary usage among different Christian groups today. And so we might get thrown off a little bit about what Paul's actually talking about. So we're going to be looking specifically at this aspect of Paul's self-identity, which I believe this understanding of what he is supposed to be as an apostle is actually maybe the most important piece that guides how he does his ministry. So to understand Paul's missionary methodology, we certainly need to look very carefully at this term. And so we're going to be looking at apostles in the New Testament. And specifically, we're asking the question, what did Paul mean when he used the word apostle to describe his call and his ministry? So there's a number of questions that I hope that we can sort of see as we go through the scriptures together. Again, what did Paul mean by claiming to be an apostle, and who else did he include in that group? And that becomes a really important question for us to understand here. 2, could there be more than 12 in the early church? I mean, we know the 12 and they're unique, but are there others that Paul would say, including himself, who are not of the 12 and they are apostles, and why? So were all apostles eyewitnesses? Well, the 12 all had to be, we know that, but were all apostles eyewitnesses? And did they go on mission? The word actually means sent on a mission, one that is sent to accomplish a task. So is that true of all the ones that we know about in the New Testament? And 5, were others who went on mission considered to be apostles besides Paul? And we know he's the Apostle Paul, so we know he was by the early church. But is that a broader term than just Paul? So let's start with a little bit about this contemporary confusion regarding terms, I would say especially in the English language. In our New Testaments, we have the word apostle, and in our church, we have the word missionary. And one of the problems is that the word missionary doesn't appear in almost any English translation. So we're reading the New Testament and there's no reference to missionaries, even though these two words have the same basic meaning. Sent one. In Greek, that's the apostolos. And in Latin, missionary comes from the Latin word for send. So it means the same thing, but we've divided them. Today, we often view them as different groups. The apostles are the 12, most likely. You know, they've been chosen by Jesus. And the missionaries are people who go out to accomplish the Great Commission. But part of this confusion is that we have both words sort of transliterated into English. This is the problem, I would say, especially with the word apostle. It meant someone sent or something sent somewhere in order to accomplish a task. And again, that's how we use the word missionary in more contemporary language in the church, but we don't see a very clear connection between these two because we've got these two different terms that seem unrelated. In New Testament times, the concept included both a task and the authority to accomplish it, because whoever sent you gave you the authority to do this task for them. Now, today, one word is more identified with task, and I would say that's missionary. right? We know missionaries are people who go out to do a task. And the other word, apostle, is identified with authority. So in Roman Catholic, Protestant, and Pentecostal theology, apostle is associated with the highest level of authority. The Pope is authoritative because he has been given the mantle of Peter and the apostles, for instance. In Protestant theology, we know that especially the New Testament and the Gospels and Paul's epistles came to us. We know that God gave them to us because he gave them through people like these apostles. And so the word apostle is sort of tied to our understanding of the New Testament having been given to us by God. And today in Pentecostal circles, an apostle is someone who speaks authoritatively and probably has some kind of control or authority over other church leaders and others today. So it's almost really today in a lot of Pentecostal circles, an apostle is almost like a bishop. When churches have disagreements, when pastors are teaching certain things, the apostle might come in and tell them the right way to go. So you can see in our common usage, missionary is the task, and in much of the Christian world, apostle refers not so much to the task, but to the authority. So let's think about the background of these terms. Now, apostello, to send, was a common Greek verb in the Greek writing and in the language of the first century. It appears over and over and over in our New Testaments. And it referred to sending someone to accomplish a task in the authority of the sender. And this is why we see in the Great Commission there is the sending of those who hear it, and they're given a very specific task, and then the authority of the sender, who is Jesus, is emphasized, because that again is the whole concept here. Those who go out on the Great Commission are not doing this on their authority. They're doing it because Jesus, the Lord of all, commanded them to go. So that's actually sort of the normal usage. This was not probably what you would say, I sent a letter down the street to my friend or something like that. No, that would probably not be apostello. This has more to do with accomplishing a task. Now, the noun form in Greek of that word is apostolos. And it was actually a pretty rare word in normal Greek usage in the first century. That is until the Christians came along in the New Testament. And it meant that which was sent. It usually referred to something sent far away, and quite often it seems the normal usage had to do with going across the ocean. So a merchant might send a fleet of ships, or a general or a king might send an army, and they might use the word apostolos, the sent ones, the ones that were sent for that kind of action. But what's unusual is that in the New Testament, along comes the church, and all of a sudden they start using this term a lot. So it's used, apostolos is used 79 times in the New Testament. I think that's more than you could find in all the other Greek literature in the first century. And what that points to is the importance the early church gave to being sent by God, especially for this task that Jesus gave the church. Now, it is used once in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And it's in 1 Kings 14:6, where it says, I am the one sent to you with a harsh message. So we do have this Old Testament connection that someone could be sent with a message. And I think that's important background for how it starts being used in the New Testament. Now, in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all explain that Jesus summoned the 12 disciples. And in the Gospels, the emphasis is on them being disciples, right? He called them together to learn from him, to figure out who he was. Then he sent them out. He gave them authority over evil spirits and to heal the sick. And then he sent them out to accomplish a task. Now, in Matthew and Mark, the only time the disciples are referred to as apostles, and they are one time in each of those Gospels, it's when they have just gone out on mission, because they are now the sent ones. They just haven't come only to learn from Jesus. He sends them out, and now they are apostles also, in addition to being disciples. Now, Luke does use the term 6 times for them throughout the Gospels, not necessarily tied to sending. I mean, though that's obviously the idea. But Luke wasn't there, and he didn't know about any of these men until long after they had become apostles. So I think if we're looking for how Jesus and the disciples themselves identified during the Gospels, Matthew and Mark are probably showing us with their only one-time usage when they're sent out by Jesus. So apostolos refers to those Jesus sent to accomplish a task with his authority. That's really what the term meant. Those who are sent by Jesus to accomplish the task he's assigning them with his own authority. Now, what we have in Acts then with the 12 is an unusual thing, because once Acts begins, they're not referred to as disciples ever again. The Great Commission has been given. Yes, they were disciples of Jesus, but now they have the task and the authority to go, so they are now the apostles. And we see that the number 12 is significant. In Acts 1, when they have to start thinking about the fact that they've lost Judas, there's only 11 of them. There's supposed to be 12. I mean, even Revelation 21 talks about the 12 apostles at the end. And it probably related to the 12 tribes, representative of the people of God. So there were 12 of these special eyewitness apostles who have followed Jesus, and now replacing Judas, it continues on into the book of Acts. Now, they didn't replace anybody else. When the other 12 members of the 12 died or persecuted or whatever happened to them, over time, the church and the apostles don't try to replace them, because they have actually accomplished their role. And that was to protect and proclaim the true message of Jesus. But Judas was different. He dropped out, and there needed to be 12 again that the church could look back to and see these were the representatives of what Jesus came to be and to teach. In Acts 1, we see very clearly that these 12 all had to be eyewitnesses of the ministry and the resurrection of Jesus. And it wasn't just they, were some of those hundreds and hundreds of people who came in and out, and I heard Jesus over here and I heard Jesus over there. No, they had to have seen pretty much the whole ministry of Jesus. And the reason for that is those Gospels aren't written down for some time. They are the only ones who can say, here is what Jesus did and here's what Jesus did not do. And again, this is a very specific group and a very unique and special group of people, these 12 apostles. And in Acts, we see when, Peter says to these early believers, we got to replace Judas. They actually turn to God. They use an old system of making a decision, and they are trusting that God is going to help them choose between these two men, both of whom seem to be equally qualified. So which one? Well, let's let God show us which one. And here we see in Acts, and we're going to see this kind of thing repeated in a couple of other places. These apostles understood their ministry or their role as service because they used the term diakonia. That means servants. But it's also a ministry of oversight and leadership, where the word episcopon is used. Again, we get bishop or Episcopalian church from this term, and then I think they also use the word apostole, which is the noun form of being sent, which I think in English really, we can say apostleship, but I think we misunderstand that. It's really talking about mission. This may be the closest word in Greek in the New Testament that actually means what we usually mean when we say that person is sent on a mission. Now, there were other eyewitnesses besides these 12 who are referred to as apostles. And we don't know exactly how many there were, but we know for certain that Paul saw the resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus and refers to his apostleship, partly based on this. And then we have James, the Lord's brother, who is also referred to very openly, very clearly as an apostle, and who saw the resurrected Jesus. That must have been a shock to him because he wasn't a follower during the ministry of Jesus, but he becomes an eyewitness of the resurrection and the leader of the church in Jerusalem. He appears to be the most prominent leader of the church in Jerusalem. So in their own spheres, Paul going to all the nations and James back in the home church in Jerusalem become very prominent leaders in this early church, in some ways almost more prominent than the 12. And I'm not talking about the universal role of bringing us the scripture and all that. Though both of them do seem to contribute to that as well. But they become, if you go to Jerusalem, James is the leader. If you're out among the churches in the nations, very likely you're going to bump into people who were led to Christ by Paul. So they're actually become very important. Now, and here's the thing, neither of these two men met the qualifications for joining the 12. And so when people have, theologians and commentators have sort of walked down through, well, what does apostle mean and who's included? We often get something like, well, there's the 12 and then there's the plus 2. There's the Paul and the James who are eyewitnesses of Jesus resurrected, but they weren't there. They don't qualify. In Acts 1, they could not have replaced Judas. They can't be one of the 12. But they are clearly in our New Testament referred to as apostles. So that's a little bit, I think, of an unusual group here, but it certainly means there are more apostles than the 12.